Trade tensions between the United States and Canada have escalated rapidly in recent months, setting off a series of retaliatory measures that have sent shockwaves through both economies. It all started when the U.S. government, under President Donald Trump, announced a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum and steel imports. The move was justified as a measure to protect American industries, but it was seen by many as an aggressive economic attack on one of the United States' closest allies. Canada wasted no time in responding, with Ontario Premier Doug Ford stepping up to the plate in a bold countermeasure. Premier Ford retaliated by imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to key U.S. states, including Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. This was a direct hit, as these states rely on imported Canadian electricity to keep the lights on and industries running. With energy costs already climbing, the surcharge threatened to drive household power bills up by an estimated $100 per month and put an additional $400,000 daily strain on these states' economies. The response from U.S. officials was immediate and furious, accusing Canada of using essential resources as leverage in a growing trade war. Things quickly spiraled as Trump retaliated, doubling down on Canadian tariffs. His administration announced plans to increase duties on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%, a move that sent shockwaves through financial markets. Investors and business leaders panicked at the prospect of a full-blown trade war between the two nations, leading to a dramatic sell-off on Wall Street. The Dow Jones Industrial Average tumbled nearly 600 points before recovering slightly to close down 478 points, a continuation of a brutal 900-point drop from the previous day. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 fell by 0.7% and the Nasdaq Composite dipped by 0.2%. Market analysts warned that the escalation could have far-reaching consequences. If the situation didn't cool down, both countries could face disruptions across multiple industries, from automotive production to consumer electronics. Investors voiced concerns that the standoff could trigger a wider economic downturn, possibly even leading to a recession. As tensions ran high, political leaders on both sides scrambled to find a way out. Premier Ford, despite his initial hardline approach, saw the writing on the wall. With pressure mounting from industry leaders and economists urging for a resolution, he initiated high-level talks with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. The discussions were described as productive by officials, though details remained vague. After a tense period of negotiations, Ford made the first move towards de-escalation, announcing a temporary suspension of the 25% electricity surcharge. The decision was seen as a strategic maneuver to cool down hostilities and create an opening for further negotiations. But it wasn't a surrender. Ford made it clear that the surcharge could be reinstated if the U.S. failed to act in good faith. The move appeared to work, at least temporarily. Trump responded by reversing his decision to increase steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%, instead opting to keep them at the original 25% level. While the situation remained volatile, this sequence of events showed how quickly economic and political pressure could force shifts in international policy. The Ontario government defended its decision, arguing that it had successfully demonstrated Canada's ability to hit back against aggressive U.S. policies. Ford's office released a statement saying, "We will always defend Ontario's economy and ensure that we are not taken advantage of in unfair trade disputes. We have shown that we will not hesitate to use our own leverage when necessary." Despite this temporary truce, the damage had already been done in some areas. Financial markets remained on edge, businesses were uncertain about long-term trade stability, and both governments were under pressure from their respective industries to negotiate a better deal. The situation also raised deeper concerns about the fragility of U.S.-Canada trade relations, which have historically been cooperative, but are now marked by unpredictable escalations. The conflict highlighted just how interconnected the economies of Canada and the United States really are. The two countries share one of the largest trading relationships in the world, with bilateral trade reaching approximately $773 billion in 2024. That's a staggering figure, proving that any disruption, no matter how small, can have major economic consequences. For businesses that rely on cross-border trade, the uncertainty has been a nightmare. From auto manufacturers who depend on Canadian steel and aluminum to American companies that source raw materials from their northern neighbor, the impact of these tariffs rippled across multiple industries. Consumers, too, began to feel the pressure. With aluminum prices rising due to tariffs, products that rely on metal, including cars, appliances, and even beverage cans, saw price hikes. Some industries tried to absorb the extra costs, but many had no choice but to pass them on to consumers. This meant higher prices at the checkout line for everyday goods, a reality that was becoming more and more evident as the trade war unfolded. Meanwhile, state officials in the U.S. were frustrated with Washington's approach. Governors in Minnesota, Michigan, and New York called for a rollback of tariffs and urged the federal government to find a diplomatic solution. Michigan's governor stated, "These tariffs are hurting working-class Americans. It's time for Washington to stop playing games and put the interests of businesses and families first." The auto industry, in particular, found itself at the center of the storm. American car manufacturers have long relied on Canadian steel and aluminum to keep production costs down. The tariffs not only increased raw material costs but also disrupted supply chains that had been in place for decades. Ford and General Motors both signaled concerns, warning that higher costs could lead to layoffs, reduced production, and ultimately higher car prices for consumers. Other industries affected included consumer electronics, construction, and even agriculture. Many products that depend on Canadian imports, whether it's machinery parts, household appliances, or packaging materials, were suddenly more expensive. Retailers faced rising costs, which trickled down to consumers who were already grappling with inflation and economic uncertainty. Even small businesses felt the strain. Many local manufacturers and suppliers that relied on cross-border trade saw their profit margins squeezed. Some were forced to look for alternative suppliers, while others had to absorb the costs and cut expenses elsewhere. Trade experts warned that the longer the dispute dragged on, the more likely it was that some businesses, especially smaller ones, might not survive. With so much at stake, all eyes were on the next round of negotiations. Would Canada and the US find a way to resolve their trade differences, or was this just the beginning of a larger economic standoff? The uncertainty loomed large as both countries braced for the next phase of the battle. Trade tensions between Canada and the United States have not only led to economic retaliation, but have also ignited a wave of nationalism across Canada. As tariffs and countermeasures continue to disrupt trade, Canadian leaders and citizens are pushing back in ways that go beyond government policies. The fight is no longer just about steel, aluminum, or electricity. It's now a matter of national pride. In response to the U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the Canadian government wasted no time implementing its own countermeasures. Canada imposed a 25% tariff on nearly $30 billion worth of U.S. imports, targeting a broad range of American goods. The tariffs covered everything from steel and aluminum to consumer products such as computers, sports equipment, and cast iron products. This move was a clear message that Canada would not sit back and accept unfair trade practices. But beyond federal actions, individual provinces also took it upon themselves to strike back against American economic aggression. Ontario was among the first to act. Following the temporary suspension of the electricity surcharge that had initially been imposed as a retaliatory measure, Ontario Premier Doug Ford continued to emphasize that Canada would not be bullied. He warned that Ontario would reinstate its trade restrictions if the U.S. made any further hostile economic moves. Meanwhile, he encouraged businesses to start looking at alternative markets and supply chains to reduce dependence on American goods. Quebec was not far behind in implementing its own retaliatory measures. Premier François Legault took a bureaucratic approach, directing the Provincial Treasury Board to review all government procurement contracts involving American suppliers. The objective was clear: favor Canadian or non-U.S. partners wherever possible to lessen reliance on American goods and services. Quebec also decided to take a symbolic yet powerful step by removing all American liquor products from shelves. The province's liquor board, Société des Alcools du Québec, followed Ontario's lead and banned American alcoholic beverages from being sold in its stores. This move was part of a broader strategy to send a message to American businesses. If the U.S. government wanted to play hardball, Canadian consumers had the power to retaliate in their own way. Across the country, people began calling for a boycott of American products. On social media, hashtags like #BuyCanadian and #SupportLocal started trending. Citizens shared lists of Canadian alternatives to American brands, urging their fellow Canadians to shift their spending habits to support local businesses instead of American corporations. British Columbia took a different but equally impactful approach. Premier David Eby called on the federal government to impose a tax on American thermal coal exported through British Columbia's ports. This measure was designed to counteract U.S. tariffs while also aligning with environmental concerns. The argument was that American coal producers were using Canadian ports because of restrictions on building new coal export facilities along the U.S. West Coast. By imposing a levy on U.S. thermal coal passing through British Columbia, Canada could strike at yet another key American industry. Environmental advocacy groups were quick to support this proposal. Organizations like Dogwood BC had long opposed the export of American thermal coal through British Columbia's ports, citing concerns about pollution and climate change. The new proposed tax on American coal exports gave them additional leverage to push for stronger environmental regulations while also supporting Canada's stance in the ongoing trade dispute. Alberta, which has historically had strong trade ties with the United States, was initially hesitant to take drastic action. However, Premier Danielle Smith eventually shifted her stance and endorsed strategic tariffs on American goods that could be sourced from Canada or other international partners. The province also began discussions about diversifying its supply chains to reduce dependency on U.S. imports. Unlike some of the other provinces, Alberta focused on a long-term economic shift rather than immediate retaliatory actions. Nova Scotia took a more direct and symbolic approach. Premier Tim Houston announced that highway tolls for U.S. vehicles passing through the province would be doubled. In addition, the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation followed the trend set by Ontario and Quebec, ceasing all sales of American liquor. The combination of these measures was intended to make it clear that Canadian provinces were willing to take meaningful action against American economic aggression. Manitoba and Prince Edward Island took an even stronger stance. Both provinces implemented a full ban on the import of American liquor. Premiers Wab Kinew and Dennis King framed their policies as necessary steps to defend Canada's economic sovereignty. Their argument was simple. Canadian businesses and workers should not have to suffer because of an unfair trade war initiated by the United States. In Yukon, Premier Ranj Pillai followed suit by suspending all U.S. alcohol imports while also reviewing government contracts with American suppliers. The territory even considered imposing tolls on U.S. vehicles traveling through its borders, though this measure was temporarily put on hold pending further negotiations. While these provincial actions were gaining momentum, the Canadian federal government continued to negotiate behind the scenes. Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney signaled that he was ready to engage in discussions with President Trump, but emphasized that any agreement must respect Canada's sovereignty. Carney stated, "I am prepared to meet with President Trump provided that our national sovereignty is fully respected and that we work towards mutually beneficial trade solutions." Carney's comments reflected a growing sentiment in Canada that the country would not back down under U.S. pressure. The trade dispute had gone beyond just economics. It had become a symbol of Canada's determination to remain independent and self-reliant. Adding to the tensions, Trump made an unprecedented remark suggesting that the only thing that makes sense is for Canada to become the 51st U.S. state. This statement was met with overwhelming opposition across Canada. Outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was quick to respond, saying, "There isn't a snowball's chance in hell that Canada would become a part of the United States." Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre echoed this sentiment, stating, "Canada will never be the 51st state. We will be a strong, independent, sovereign country." The annexation proposal was widely rejected by the Canadian public as well. Polling indicated that 90% of Canadians opposed the idea of joining the United States. The backlash was so strong that it fueled a surge in Canadian nationalism, with citizens proudly displaying Canadian flags, supporting domestic businesses, and embracing their country's cultural identity even more fiercely than before. Despite the rising tensions, some experts urged both sides to focus on negotiation rather than escalation. Economists warned that continued retaliation could damage both economies, leading to job losses and economic instability. Business leaders on both sides of the border pushed for a resolution, emphasizing that free trade between the U.S. and Canada had historically been beneficial for both countries. The ongoing trade war between the United States and Canada has already sent shockwaves through financial markets, political circles, and public opinion. But perhaps the most significant consequences are being felt in key industries across both nations. Tariffs, retaliatory measures, and shifting supply chains are not just headlines. They're reshaping economies, threatening jobs, and forcing companies to rethink how they do business. At the center of the trade dispute is the impact on North America's largest industries, particularly the automotive sector. The United States heavily depends on Canadian steel and aluminum for vehicle manufacturing, with major automakers sourcing raw materials from their northern neighbor to keep production costs manageable. The tariff increase on Canadian aluminum, initially set at 25% and nearly doubled at one point before being reduced back to its original rate, has drastically increased production costs for U.S. automakers. One of the hardest-hit vehicles is the Ford F-150, one of the best-selling trucks in North America, which relies heavily on aluminum for its body panels and frame. Analysts estimate that the tariff-induced rise in aluminum prices could add approximately $400 to the production cost of each F-150, a burden that could either be passed down to consumers in the form of higher sticker prices or lead to cost-cutting measures in production. And it's not just Ford. General Motors, Stellantis, and Tesla are also feeling the pinch. The increased cost of raw materials has caused industry-wide concern that US-produced vehicles will become significantly more expensive, making them less competitive in global markets. In Canada, auto parts manufacturers and suppliers are facing similar struggles. Many companies in Ontario's automotive corridor, which supplies parts to US automakers, have had to absorb higher costs while dealing with uncertainty about future trade policies. Some manufacturers are already looking to diversify their markets, seeking new partnerships with European and Asian automakers to reduce reliance on the US auto industry. The long-term effects of this shift could be devastating for American car companies, as Canada has been one of their most stable and reliable suppliers for decades. The tariffs have also hit consumer goods industries, particularly electronics and household appliances. Computers, a key product in cross-border trade, are now facing higher import duties, leading to increased cost for retailers and potentially higher prices for consumers. With many components of consumer electronics manufactured in Canada, American businesses that depend on these parts have found themselves scrambling for alternatives, either having to pay more or source from countries like China, where supply chain disruptions have already made trade difficult. Sporting goods have been another surprising casualty of the trade war. Hockey sticks, bicycles, and fitness equipment, many of which are produced in Canada, are now subject to increased costs when imported into the United States. Retailers and distributors across the US have struggled to keep prices competitive, as higher import costs have made Canadian-made sports gear more expensive than products from other international manufacturers. Given that hockey is such a huge market in North America, this industry shift is hitting both consumers and suppliers hard. Beyond manufactured goods, energy and resource industries are also facing disruptions. One of the most significant Canadian countermeasures in the trade war has been the proposed tax on American thermal coal exports passing through British Columbia's ports. This proposal, spearheaded by Premier David Eby, has drawn both support and criticism. Environmental groups such as Dogwood BC have long argued against the transportation of American coal through Canadian territory, citing concerns over air pollution and climate change. But beyond environmental concerns, the move is seen as an economic weapon aimed at the US coal industry, which depends on Canadian ports to ship coal to Asian markets. The impact of blocking or heavily taxing US coal exports through British Columbia would be severe. In 2023, the Port of Vancouver handled approximately 17.6 million metric tons of thermal coal, making it one of North America's largest export hubs for this commodity. Of that total volume, nearly 11.7 million metric tons originated from the United States, primarily from Montana and Wyoming, where the Powder River Basin remains a major coal-producing region. If Canada were to restrict these exports, American coal producers would face significant logistical challenges, as there are no major U.S. West Coast ports with the infrastructure to handle such large volumes of coal exports. The economic consequences for the U.S. coal industry could be devastating, with potential mine closures and job losses in coal-dependent states. The lack of alternative export routes would drive up transportation costs and make U.S. coal less competitive in the global market. This is exactly the kind of economic leverage Canada hopes to use to counterbalance U.S. tariffs on its industries. Meanwhile, another heavily affected sector is agriculture. Farmers in both countries have expressed deep concerns about how tariffs are disrupting trade flows, affecting prices, and creating uncertainty in the agricultural market. Canada is one of the biggest buyers of U.S. agricultural products, and retaliatory tariffs on American farm goods have already caused billions in losses for U.S. farmers. At the same time, Canadian agricultural exports, particularly beef and grain, have faced higher costs and barriers when exporting to American markets. Supply chain disruptions have also rippled through retail and distribution networks, affecting the availability of products in both countries. Canadian businesses that rely on U.S. imports have been forced to reconsider their supply chains, looking to European and Asian suppliers to replace certain American goods. Meanwhile, American retailers are struggling to absorb the increased costs of Canadian imports, leading to potential price hikes on everyday consumer products. The financial markets have remained volatile throughout this dispute. Investors worry that if the trade war continues to escalate, both economies could suffer long-term damage. A prolonged trade conflict could lead to slower economic growth, lower consumer confidence, and job losses, particularly in industries that rely heavily on cross-border trade. Analysts have pointed out that the U.S.-Canada trade relationship is one of the largest in the world, and any sustained disruption could have global repercussions. Despite these economic consequences, the political standoff remains unresolved. U.S. President Donald Trump's remark that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state added fuel to the fire, leading to an overwhelming backlash from Canadian leaders and citizens. The response from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was swift and direct, stating that there was no chance in hell that Canada would ever agree to such a proposition. Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre echoed this sentiment, affirming that Canada will always remain an independent and sovereign nation. Public sentiment in Canada has strongly favored retaliatory measures against the United States, with 90% of Canadians opposing the idea of closer integration with the U.S. Instead, many have turned their focus towards supporting domestic industries and reducing economic reliance on American markets. This trade war has, in a way, strengthened Canadian nationalism, encouraging businesses and consumers to prioritize local goods over American imports. As both governments continue negotiations, businesses, workers, and consumers remain uncertain about what lies ahead. The trade battle has already reshaped industries, altered supply chains, and heightened economic anxieties. Whether the two nations can find common ground, or whether tensions will continue escalating, remains to be seen. What do you think? Should Canada continue pushing back, or is it time for both sides to come to an agreement?